I was asked to go first, and thanks, Russell, for inviting me. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful fall evening in Atlanta. I'm honored to be here. We had a conference call, the four of us, not long ago to decide the order of who's speaking and what topics are covered, and I was given the first spot. I'm supposed to be the academic, which I guess works because I'm an academic. So I'm an economist. I got my degree actually not too far from here. I got my degree down I-85 at Auburn, and I taught for 5 years at Clemson. And so I taught at both the Tiger schools, which are on either side of the Atlanta metro area. The chief insight of economics, it's not too much to say, is unintended consequences. Oh, I should say we each total speak for about 20 minutes, so you have some idea about how long I'm going to talk, 15 to 20 minutes, is unintended consequences. Economics as a discipline started in 1776 with a guy named Adam Smith. He wrote a book that's popularly called The Wealth of Nations, and the most famous phrase in that book is the invisible hand, and you've probably heard of it. And the point of the invisible hand is Adam Smith said, look, most of what happens in this society of ours is not intended by anybody. It's the result of an invisible hand. And by that, he didn't mean a literal invisible hand. It was his metaphor for the fact that things happen that people don't intend. In his case, he was talking about good unintended consequences. Atlanta gets fed every day. Atlanta is a city of millions of people. Every day, millions of people get fed, and fed pretty well. And they have electricity pumped into their homes, and the water, and the roads work reasonably well. They have gasoline in the pumps. And it's not because this is the intention of anybody. There's no great czar that said, let's plan for how Atlanta will be fed today. Atlanta gets fed every day because you have millions of people, actually hundreds of millions of people from around the world doing things, farmers, truckers, suppliers of various inputs, doing things for their own benefit. Mostly they want to make money, they want to earn an income, they want to have their companies profit, and the result is that Atlanta gets fed every day. So too does New York, so too does Paris. This is an example of a good unintended consequence. A lot of unintended consequences, and the ones that I'm going to focus on today, are bad unintended consequences, and these are the ones that mostly result from government regulations. There are two reasons why people miss or don't think of or fail to anticipate, which is why they're called unintended consequences. Fail to anticipate unintended consequences. Number one, people instinctively, I think, judge actions by their stated intentions and not by their results. Number two, people fail to look at the consequences of actions beyond the immediate effect. I tell my 18-year-old students, I said, you know, if you're standing on the 60th floor of the Empire State Building and you see someone fall past you, looking out the window, and this person's still alive, flailing his arms, and you can tell they're still alive because they're screaming. And you don't conclude that, well, falling off the Empire State Building doesn't lead to any bad consequences. You know, you have to look at the whole process all the way down to the bitter end. In this case, a bitter end. You have to look at the entire sequence of consequences. And when people judge or assess the effects of government regulations, they do so in the same way that this hypothetical person judges the effects of jumping off the Empire State Building by looking at the still alive person on the fall past the 60th floor. They fail to look at the full sequence. If you look at the full sequence, you get a different picture. And the failure to judge actions by results rather than looking at intentions, and the failure to look at the full consequences are related. Let me tell you one of my favorite examples, historical examples, of the importance of results and incentives rather than stated intentions. In the 19th century, as you probably know, the British used the continent of Australia as a penal colony. So really bad criminals in Britain, many of them were stuck on ships and they were shipped from Britain to Australia. This is back in the 19th century. That was a long, long journey by sea back then. until I forget the exact year, sometime in the 1840s, I believe the survival rate of the prisoners on these prisoner ships was about 50%. So for every 100 prisoners that were loaded onto the ships, about 50 walked off alive. So pretty high death rate. And the British were appalled at this. Why do we have such a high death rate? And one way to change it is you could plead with the captains, please, please do better. Please, please treat your prisoners better, feed them better, protect them better from diseases. Make sure they have more breathable living space. They tried that. It didn't work. So an economist, someone we would call an economist today, named Edwin Chadwick, had a good idea. He said, look, forget about trying to change their intentions. Let's change the incentives. Right now, we, the British government, are paying captains according to the number of prisoners who are loaded onto the ship. Let's instead change the payment system and pay them according to the number of prisoners who walk off alive from the ships in Australia. Very simple change. Guess what happened to the survival rate? It went from 50% to 98%, almost immediately. One small change. And it had nothing to do with intentions. Well, I assume that the captains were the same people before as after. They had the same kind of character. The thing that changed is their incentives changed. They got paid according to the number of prisoners who left the ship rather than the number of people who walked on to the ship. So that was the high death rate of these ships was the unintended consequence of a poor incentive system. No one, I'm sure no one designed it that way. Said, let's make sure we kill a lot of prisoners by paying the captains in an economically unjustified way. It was an unintended consequence of a bad payment system. You change the incentive, you change the system to become better, you get better outcomes. In the United States, I could spend not 20 minutes, I could spend 20 hours just giving you story after story of really bad unintended consequences from government regulation, from regulations that we can presume are well-intentioned. Let me preface what I am about to say by saying I do not presume that all of these regulations are well-intentioned. But even if we grant the assumption that the people who enacted these regulations and the people who enforce them intend to do well, then the consequences are often malignant. In a famous study done about 40 years ago in the Journal of Law and Economics, there was an investigation of the occupational licensing of electricians. Different states in the U.S. License electricians differently. Some states have much more stringent regulations for electricians than do other states. And so these researchers looked at the consequences of this the different degrees of electrician regulation. How difficult is it to become an electrician? Now, presumably, the goal of requiring stringent, the people who want to be electricians meet stringent requirements before setting up shop as electricians, presumably the goal of that is to make the world a safer place. And it kind of makes sense. Well, if we have really strict testing for who can become an electrician, that means there'll be fewer electrical fires. That means there'll be fewer electrical accidents. That's a good thing. So let's make it really strict. Let's make the requirements really strict before we allow anyone to be a practicing electrician. Well, economists looked at this, and guess what they found? They found that states with the highest, most strict requirements for becoming an electrician had the highest number of household fatalities from electrical fires and electrical accidents. States with the least restrictive regulations, I believe Mississippi was one of them, had the least accidents. And when you think about it, it makes sense. So one consequence of making it very difficult for someone to set up shop as an electrician is that it reduces the supply of electricians who are able to sell their services. When you reduce the supply of electricians who can sell their services, what happens to the price that electricians charge? It goes up. When the price of electricians charge goes up, that means people are less likely to hire an electrician to do wiring and do electrical things in their house. What's a substitute for this? You do it yourself. Most people who do it themselves are not electricians. And so you have these do-it-yourself electricians who are doing their own wiring, That's a lot more dangerous than having wiring done even by a not the top quality electrician. So the consequence of electrician occupational licensing was more deaths and injuries from electrical mishaps than fewer. A famous example, it's not quite as sexy as electrician example, is Social Security saving. Economists have studied this quite a lot. The idea behind Social Security in the US, of course, is that, well, people are not going to save enough for their retirement, so if we force them to save, we take money out of their paychecks today, we promise them a certain return upon retirement, that means they'll have more savings for their retirement when, in fact, they do retire. Among all economists who I consider to be serious students of the subject, the conclusion is unanimous. That one consequence, there are many other bad consequences, but one notable consequence of Social Security is that it reduces the rate of savings of the typical American. They know that they're going to get paid Social Security when they retire, and so that enables them to reduce the rate of savings today. That's a fairly straightforward application of the notion of unintended consequences. Shoot, shovel, and shut up is a pretty euphonious example. This occurs under the environmental statutes. There's a famous study in economics that was done about 25 years ago in one of the more prominent journals. In North Carolina, the red-cockaded woodpecker was declared to be an endangered animal under the Endangered Species Act. And of course, if an endangered animal is found on your property, then suddenly you lose many of the rights you have to your property. You can't develop your property in ways that you could if that animal were not on your property. The government puts a lot of restrictions allowed by the environmental statutes. And so what these studies found is that timber owners in North Carolina, after the red-cockaded woodpecker was put on the endangered species list, red-cockaded woodpeckers like to nest in old-growth pine forests, in pine trees that are 40 years, generally have reached the age of 40 years or more. That's their preferred nesting. So if you want to save red-cockaded woodpeckers, you want to maximize the amount of old-growth pine forests around. Well, if you're a timber owner in North Carolina, you discover this, and you have some timber growth that's, say, 35 years, you tend to cut it down pretty quickly. And that's what they discovered, that after the red-cockaded woodpecker was put on the endangered species list, timber owners in North Carolina, who in the past had allowed their timber to grow to be up to 70 years before they cut it, because it becomes more valuable. Suddenly that stopped in all the places, anywhere close to where the red-cockaded woodpecker might nest, and all these pine forests are being cut down just prior to turning 40 years, because that's just prior to the time that the red-cockaded woodpecker would want to nest in those forests. So here's a regulation designed to make the red-cockaded woodpecker more abundant, that had exactly the opposite effect. It gave landowners an incentive to destroy the habitat that these birds like. Just the opposite effect of the statute. Two more examples. I'll end with my favorite. But before I get to that one, there was another study done about dental licensing. As with electricians, different states license, this is not dental licensing, dental advertising. So different states have different regulations on how much dentists can advertise. And the notion is that dentists who are allowed to advertise a lot, they can mislead consumers. So we don't want consumers to be misled by advertising by dentists. It's sort of unseemly to have dentists hawking their services through crass advertising. A lot of states reason that way. Other states, it's much more laissez-faire in allowing dentists to advertise. Well, not surprisingly, there have several studies on this. Studies find that in states where dentists are allowed to advertise pretty freely, dental prices are lower, so more people go to the dentist, and by various measures of dental health, states that allow states that put fewer restrictions on dental advertising have more dental health than in states that put higher restrictions on dental advertising. Who'd have thunk it? You don't think that restrictions on dental advertising would actually have an effect on people's dental hygiene and health, but it does, because advertising is actually a way to compete. If you're allowed to advertise your services on the radio, advertise your services in the newspaper, advertise your services on television with fewer restrictions, then people can find out about you, and that creates more competition among dentists. That lowers the price, and that makes it more likely that people who need dental work will go to dentists. But if that competition is less intense and dental prices are higher, then people don't go to the dentist as much and they have more dental problems. My final example is somewhat more involved. I'm an economist. I love economics. I'm not generally proud of my profession, because most economists of the past 100 years, there are exceptions, have become social engineering wannabes. They want to engineer society. Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, some of my favorites are exceptions to that, but more and more economists are social engineers. There's at least one case where economists have done a great good service to the American economy or Americans' health. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember, some of you are, the 1980s. There was a famous air crash that took place sometime in the mid to late 1980s. 84, 85, 86. I believe it was Republic Air. It was an airline that is now defunct. And this was about the time when people had just started to have camcorders, long before people could take pictures or videos with their there were no cell phones. And this was a crash in Sioux City, Iowa. This 737 was caught on film crashing onto a runway in Sioux City, Iowa. Fortunately, it wasn't the worst crash. Many people on board the aircraft survived the crash, but a number of people died. Among the people who died on the aircraft was a small child. What makes it particularly tragic is that the child who died was seated in a portion of the aircraft where everyone else survived. It was discovered that the child died, this is undisputed, the child died because it was not strapped with a seatbelt into a seat. And so when the plane hit the runway very hard, the child went catapulting across the fuselage and smashed into the side of the air, smashed into the wall and was killed. And it's undisputed that had this child been strapped into the seat with a seatbelt, the child almost certainly would have survived the crash. When some congressmen heard about this, they proposed a statute. They introduced a bill to require from now on that all passengers, not just people above the age of 2, but all passengers be seat belted into their seats, because they wanted to save the lives of children. My fellow heroic economists went to work. And they went to Capitol Hill and they testified against the statute. And it seemed horrible to a lot of people. You economists are testifying against a statute designed to keep young children alive. And we had little devil horns, right? Wore red capes. Right? So, but think about it. This is a beautiful example. So economists started reasoning, so, well, let's see. Why was that child not strapped into a seat? You tell me. Anybody know? The child was under 2. You know the airline's policy. Children 2 and younger can fly for free if they sit in their parents' laps. Right? Then you can buy a seat for a 2-year-old child. But if you do that, you have to pay the fare. Now the airlines can do this, of course, because allowing a 2-year-old, a young child to sit on an adult's lap doesn't take up a seat, so it doesn't cost the airline very much at all to allow the child to fly. The seat that's not bought remains available to be sold to another paying passenger. So economists said, look, the first thing he said is, the reason the child was not strapped in was because it was obviously due to the airline policy of allowing children 2 and younger to fly for free. So if Congress passes this bill, will airlines continue with the policy of allowing children 2 years or younger to fly for free? clearly the answer is no, because even a newborn infant will now take up a valuable seat, so airlines will charge for all children, even very young ones, to fly. Now, what's a substitute for flying? Driving. What's more dangerous, driving or flying? Driving is far more dangerous. So economists whipped out their statistical methods. We have a lot of data on traffic fatalities, a lot of data on the risks of flying. And so they did some statistical studies, and they estimated how much the higher cost of flying would have on the demand for parents with children to fly. They had some good data from which they could estimate those costs. And they concluded that if Congress passed that statute, then the number of children who would die over the years from traveling would rise. And fortunately, it's an astonishing outcome. Congress listened to the economists. That itself should be more news than it is, but the statute somehow failed to pass, and that was a good thing. And economists got criticized for this. Well, you economists, you opposed a law that would save children from death. But think of the couples, think of the people who were most likely to fly with young children. They tend to be young couples. Young couples are not yet in their prime income earning years. So you could have a couple, they're in their mid-30s or early 30s, they have a newborn infant, they have an 18-month-old, they live in Atlanta, they want to visit the in-laws in Washington, D.C. at holiday time. Well, if this law were passed, it would double the cost to this young family of traveling from Atlanta to Washington. We'd make a lot of these families switch from flying to driving, which would increase the overall risk of dying in traffic accidents. So the number of children that would have died would have increased. So I think this is an example of an unintended consequence that fortunately did not happen. Had Congress, as it usually does, had the government, as it usually does, rushed in an emotional way to pass a statute and impose a regulation, it would have resulted in more deaths of the very people that the regulation was ostensibly meant to help. As I said, I could spend not just 20 minutes that I did, I could spend 20 hours just listing for you, giving you a litany of regulations having really awful, sometimes funny, unintended consequences. But I was given 20 minutes, and I want to stick to the intentions of the organizer. So thank you. Are we taking questions now or after everyone speaks?
Now and after Warren speaks and after Kelly speaks. So
Okay.
We can get it out.
Yes, ma'am. I think we have a microphone.
Are these examples in any of your publications?
I'm sure they are somewhere. I've written them. I've written them up somewhere. I didn't do any. I confess I didn't do any new and original research for this. You don't have to for this topic. This is one of these old chestnuts for economists to look at these unintended consequences. If you email me and you can't find them, email me. I'll be happy to find them for you and send you links to them. Right here.
I do a little guest lecturing at Kennesaw State on economic outcomes based on regulations and whatever. And one of the things that I talk about is what caused this debacle in 2007, 2008, the big recession, financial crisis. And I take it back to 1977 with the implementation of the CRA, Community Reinvestment Act. What's your feeling about how that affected? You don't have to give a big dissertation, but.
Well, that's not my area. I have no doubt that the CRA played some role. I don't think the CRA by itself was responsible. My best guess is that it was a combination of very loose monetary policy after the dot-com busts. So from 2001 to 2006, the Fed increased the money supply. The incentives, unintended consequences facing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to back up mortgage loans played a role. The CRA was part of the push. Part of the push to get home ownership. We can argue, it's not that long ago, it seems like yesterday to me, where George Bush in 2005 was going on about, well, we got to get home ownership up. Barney Frank, of all people, is complaining that we're not getting home ownership up fast enough. It was an ocean's worth of awful government interventions that led to it, not just one, but the CRA was certainly part of it.
Professor Boudreaux, big fan. So two questions. I probably don't need it.
I can hear you.
So what would be the unintended consequences of a travel ban to the affected countries?
Of what?
Of the travel ban to the West African countries. And second, sort of same thing, unintended consequences of student loans and student loan policy today.
I can answer the latter much easier than the first. You're talking about the Ebola inspired. Yeah, I haven't. That's so new. I haven't given that much thought, so I hesitate to make any.
Okay.
Well, my instinct is always bans are bad, but there are always exceptions to even the most rigorous rule. I haven't thought about that one enough to make any firm statement on. As far as the unintended consequences of government-backed student loans, I'm a happy beneficiary of some of the unintended consequences of government. I have no doubt that my pay as a college professor is much higher than it would otherwise be. Right? So for that, I'm grateful. The reasoning is pretty straightforward. If government backs student loans for post-secondary education, that makes the real cost to families of sending kids to college lower. The theory that a lot of people who don't think past the first stage have is that, well, if we make government loans cheaper, if we make loans to make it easier for people to borrow money, make it cheaper for people to borrow money to send their kids to college, then more kids will go to college. They don't think about, well, what will happen to tuition? What will happen to fees? Colleges aren't dumb. I worked at colleges most of my life. I disagree with much of what my fellow academics think and do, but I've never accused them of being stupid or being not self-interested. They don't think they're self-interested, but they are self-interested. So what happens is tuition rises. And when tuition rises, then you're able to increase the pay of faculty. The consequence, I have no doubt, and there are studies on this that back this up, that there's a high correlation between greater government aid to post-secondary education and rising tuition costs and rising faculty and college administration pay. So narrowly, I'm happy, but I think it's a very bad policy. And of course, it's a completely unintended consequence. Yes, sir?
So I have questions about the difference between unintended and perverse consequences.
Yeah.
Perverse incentives. So how would you say is it more likely for government regulation to cause perverse incentives that go against the intent or work contrary to the actual intention of the regulation, as opposed to unintended consequences that might harm some secondary?
I think you have both. You're right to point out that not all consequences are unintended, even though they can be perverse, and vice versa. Not all consequences are, well, it can be one or the other, or both. In my short remarks here, I granted the assumption that government agents are well-intentioned. They mean to do well. They mean to enable more people to attend college. But they choose means, they choose methods that have perverse results. In fact, I don't believe that all of these intentions are in fact so above board and commendable. Take the minimum wage, for example. This is a great example of unintended consequences. The minimum wage, we say, well, it's intended to make life easier for low-income workers. And then economists say, yeah, but look at the actual result. By raising employers' costs of hiring low-skilled workers, you cause a lot of these low-skilled workers who otherwise would find jobs at some wage to be unemployed at a zero wage. You make them worse off. That's a fine story to tell, depending on the context. However, and while I do believe that there are many people who support the minimum wage because they genuinely think it helps and they don't understand the economics of it, there are also many people who support the minimum wage because they fully understand the consequences of it. They want to price low-skilled workers out of the market because it helps higher skilled workers. By pricing a lot of low-skilled workers out of the market, you open up, in many cases, a higher demand. You create a higher demand for more skilled workers who know they stand to benefit from the higher minimum wage. Real quickly, one of my favorite examples, well, look at how the the national minimum wage was enacted. The current minimum wage that we have at the national level traces its origins back to the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act. A naive person would think that, well, the goal of that 1938 Act was to raise the wages of low-skilled workers. It may have been good or bad economics, but that was the goal. That wasn't the goal at all. The people back in the 1930s at least were more blunt. You can look at the congressional record and see that, well, in fact, the people who lobbied most intensely for the national minimum wage, they weren't low-paid workers. You know, they were textile mill owners in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. Textile mill owners. Well, why would textile mill owners lobby for a minimum wage? You know, the reason is because textile mill owners there understood that they were losing market share to the upstart textile mills in North Georgia and in the Carolinas. Well, the average wage of textile mill workers in the South back then was 15 cents an hour. The first national minimum wage was 25 cents an hour. So if you're a textile mill owner in Massachusetts where wages are already much higher, you think this is a brilliant idea. Wow, if we pass a minimum wage, it makes me look good. I'm trying to help workers. But in fact, I know what it's going to do is it's going to take away the main competitive advantage of my main competitors. They won't be able to afford to pay these workers what they're paying them, and so that'll open up markets for me. That was the origin of the federal minimum wage. And I know not a single economist who has studied even ones who favor the minimum wage, who've studied the origins of the minimum wage, who question that story. There's no doubt that was the origins of it. So that's an example where the actual unintended consequence was perfectly intended. It was meant to put poor Southern workers out of a job.
Okay, next.
One more real quick. Yeah.
So with that said, do you think that the new push to increase the minimum wage is trying to do the same thing, since like the Southern Belt is more of a service center opposed to the northern states?
I think it's a combination of economic misunderstanding and a combination of some of those forces. Labor unions support raising the minimum wage, because labor unions do not unionize unskilled workers by and large. Labor unions understand that if you price low-skilled workers out of jobs, that will make it now more profitable in some cases to hire members of labor unions. That said, there are many people who I do not doubt are very well intentioned. They want to help the lowest of the low-skilled workers. They think that the minimum wage is a way to do it, and that's why they support it. I think they are wrong. I think that their economic understanding is wrong. So I think it's a combination of both. It's a combination of economic misunderstanding, and it's a combination, in other cases, of more pernicious intentions. Thank you.
Yes.